Only 11% of Americans retire between 55 and 59, which means if you're thinking about it, you've already done something most people never pull off. But there's a number almost nobody calculates before they walk out the door. And once you see what that number actually costs you over a lifetime, not just in Social Security, but in what the system quietly takes back from you the moment you stop working, the decision looks very different. That number is what this entire video is about. You've probably heard that retiring early is the goal. Financial independence content has spent the last decade telling you that leaving early means you won. You built the portfolio. You ran the math. You hit the threshold. And if you're thinking about 55, you're not dreaming. You're planning. That's different from most people. And you know it. But there's a specific belief embedded in that planning that almost no one questions. It goes something like this: if I have enough invested to cover my expenses, I'm fine. And that belief is not wrong exactly. It's just incomplete in a way that compounds quietly for the next 30 years. The retirement math, most people run accounts for their portfolio. It accounts for spending. It might account for inflation. What it almost never accounts for, at least not with the precision it deserves, is what Social Security does to your lifetime income when you leave the workforce at 55. Not what it pays you. What it takes away from you. Permanently. Most people assume Social Security is something that happens to them later. A fixed benefit that kicks in when they're ready to claim it. The truth is that Social Security is something that's happening to you right now. Every year you're working, and what happens between now and 55, and more importantly, what stops happening after 55, matters more than almost anything else in your retirement plan. That's the open question here. Not whether you can retire at 55. You might be able to. The question is what the system actually does to your benefit when you do, and whether the number you've been assuming is anywhere close to accurate. Social Security calculates your benefit using your 35 highest earning years, not your most recent years. Not your best 5. Your 35 best measured by inflation-adjusted wages across your entire career. If you retire at 55 and you started working at 22, you've got 33 years of earnings history. That's 2 years short of the 35-year calculation window. Social Security doesn't wave those missing years away. It fills them in with zeros. 2 years of zero income averaged into your benefit calculation, pulling that number down permanently. And if you started your career later, or took time off for family, or had low-income years in your 20s that you were counting on later high-income years to replace, the gap gets worse. Every zero that fills a spot in your 35-year average is money that doesn't exist in your benefit formula. Not money that's delayed. Money that's gone. But that's just the calculation penalty. There's a second hit that's completely separate. To receive full Social Security benefits, you have to reach what the SSA calls your full retirement age. For most people in the current workforce, that's 67. You can claim as early as 62, but claiming before your full retirement age means a permanent reduction. We're not talking about a temporary dip while you wait for the system to catch up. We're talking about a lower monthly payment for the rest of your life. Claim at 62, and you lose up to 30% of your full benefit. Every month, for 20 or 30 years, permanently. So if you retire at 55, here's what the math looks like. You spend 7 to 12 years funding your own retirement with no Social Security income at all. You potentially arrive at 62 with a reduced benefit because of the zeros in your 35-year calculation. And if you claim at 62 to close the income gap, you lock in the reduced rate permanently. 3 separate hits. Most people only see the first one. The Vanguard Center for Retirement Research published data showing that the lifetime income difference between claiming at 62 versus 67 for an average earner is often $100,000 or more. For higher earners, that gap can reach $200,000 or beyond. That's not what you lose per year. That's the cumulative gap in what lands in your account over a retirement lifetime. And that's before we account for the earnings years you stopped accumulating at 55. There's also a piece of this most people completely miss. The Social Security statement you've been looking at online, the one that shows your projected benefit, is built on an assumption that you keep working at your current income until you claim. Not until 55. Until the claiming age you're viewing. So when the statement says your benefit at 67 is $2,400 a month, that number already assumes you will keep generating wage income for another 12 years. If you retire at 55, that number is wrong. It's not your projected benefit. It's someone else's. Yours, with 12 years of zeros filling the gap, is lower. Most people build their entire retirement financial plan on a number that doesn't apply to them. The AARP Public Policy Institute has documented this discrepancy specifically for early retirees, noting that the gap between the projected benefit shown on Social Security statements and the actual benefit received by people who stopped working before 62 can be 20% or more, depending on how many zeros fill the calculation window and how steep the claiming reduction is. That's a planning error built into the most trusted document most people use when they decide retirement is financially possible. Here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't a knowledge problem for most early retirees. They've read the rules, they know about full retirement age, they know about the earnings formula, but they still underestimate the actual damage. And there's a specific psychological reason why. Psychologists call it optimism bias, the well-documented tendency for people who are competent and successful, people who have genuinely done the work, to underweight negative outcomes when they're in a state of achievement. And retiring at 55 is, by almost any measure, a state of achievement. You built something. You earned this. And when your brain is in that mode, it is genuinely harder to sit with a worst-case scenario than it is under normal circumstances. Not because you're naive, because success produces a specific cognitive filter that competent people are the last to notice in themselves. Research from Cornell's Behavioral Decision Lab found that high-confidence decision-makers in achievement states systematically underestimated the probability of negative downstream consequences of their choices, not because they lacked information, but because the information they held got processed through a framework that prioritized confirming the decision over stress testing it. In practical terms, you ran the numbers that supported retirement at 55. You may not have run the numbers that argued against it with equal rigor, not because you're sloppy, because your brain at that moment wasn't optimized to find them. And there's a second mechanism layered underneath that one. Social Security benefits feel abstract and distant at 55. You can't claim them. You can't see them. They exist as a projection on a government website, and projections are easy to round up. The actual cash you have in your portfolio is concrete and immediate. Loss aversion, which Daniel Kahneman's research quantified as roughly twice as powerful as equivalent gains, runs in the wrong direction here, because the loss isn't visible yet. You're not losing Social Security income at 55. You're giving up future Social Security income in exchange for present freedom, and the human brain consistently and predictably discounts future losses against present gains. That's not a flaw in your reasoning. That's how the system is wired. The problem is that Social Security doesn't care how your brain is wired. The reduction is permanent. The zeros in your calculation are permanent. The gap between what you'll collect and what you would have collected if you'd worked to 62 or 67 is real, measurable, and once you retire at 55, largely unchangeable. Let's make this concrete because abstraction is where the danger lives. The Social Security Administration uses a formula to calculate your primary insurance amount, the base number your benefit is built on. That formula is progressive, which means it replaces a higher percentage of income for lower earners than for higher earners. But the relevant point here is this. Your final working years are often your highest earning years, and your highest earning years carry the most weight in bumping lower earning years out of your 35-year calculation. If you're 55 and you're in your peak earning decade, which for college-educated professionals statistically runs from 50 to 65, you are leaving at the exact moment your earning history would be replacing your lowest paid early career years in the Social Security formula. Those replacement years aren't just income you're not earning. They're calculation slots that would have permanently elevated your base benefit. Every year you work past 55 at your current income is likely removing a lower paid year from your 35-year average and replacing it with something significantly higher. The benefit doesn't just grow because you waited to claim. It grows because the underlying calculation improves. Stop at 55, and those improvements stop with you. Not some of them, all of them, for every year between now and when you would have stopped working. Now add the healthcare layer. Medicare eligibility begins at 65. If you retire at 55, you are self-funding your health insurance for 10 years. That's not a footnote. A Kaiser Family Foundation analysis found that average healthcare costs for a 55-year-old couple on the private market run between $22,000 and $28,000 per year in premiums alone, before deductibles, copays, or any actual care. Over 10 years, that's a draw on your portfolio in the range of $200,000 to $280,000 at today's costs, before inflation. And healthcare inflation has historically outrun general inflation by 2 to 3 percentage points annually. That's money leaving your portfolio during the decade it most needs to compound. And it's money that stops leaving once you hit 65. But by then, you've already spent it. Here's what this adds up to. Reduced Social Security base benefit from the zeros. Permanent monthly reduction if you claim at 62 to fill the income gap. $200,000 plus in healthcare costs drawing down the portfolio, and a 7 to 12-year window where the entire cost of your life has to come from assets alone, with no government income of any kind. Each of those is a real number. Together, they can represent the difference between a retirement that works and one that runs out. Not at 85, but at 78 or 80 when you're too old to go back and too young to stop needing money. And here's the compounding layer that makes this worse than it looks on paper. The money you spend on healthcare between 55 and 65 is money that would otherwise have stayed in the market. If you're drawing $25,000 per year for healthcare premiums from a portfolio that would otherwise grow at 7% annually, the real cost of that decade of healthcare isn't $250,000. It's closer to $345,000 when you account for the growth you gave up. Every dollar you pull early doesn't just disappear. It stops compounding. And in the decade between 55 and 65, when most people's portfolios are at their largest and the compounding math is most powerful, early draws have their highest long-term cost. This is why the $200,000 plus healthcare figure isn't the number that should frighten you. The opportunity cost of spending that money during peak compounding years is the number that should frighten you. It's the difference between a portfolio that reaches 75 intact and one that reaches 75 at 60% of its projected value, and you're now funding 15 or 20 more years of life from something that's already been cut down. Before we get to the part that actually changes how you think about this decision, if you're finding this useful, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and make sure you don't miss the breakdown of what the 4% rule actually gets wrong for early retirees. Okay, none of this is your fault. That's not a throwaway line. It's the most important structural point in this entire video. Social Security was not designed with early retirees in mind. It was built on an assumption that you work from your mid-20s to somewhere around 65, and then you stop. The 35-year calculation window, the full retirement age, the benefit structure, all of it is calibrated for a career that runs roughly 40 years. If you retire at 55, you're not gaming the system. You're running a different race on a track that wasn't built for your starting position. That matters because a lot of early retirement planning content treats the Social Security penalty as a personal failure. You didn't save enough. You didn't plan correctly. You should have thought about this sooner. That framing isn't just unhelpful. It's wrong. The system has structural rules that produce specific outcomes when you exit early. Those outcomes are predictable. They're calculable. They're not a punishment for bad behavior. They're just the math of a system that assumed you'd stay longer. Which means the right response isn't guilt, it's precision. Early retirees who navigate this well don't do it by pushing through the standard advice and hoping the math works out. They do it by understanding exactly what the system does to their benefit under their specific timeline, and then building the financial architecture around that reality rather than around a projection they haven't stress tested. That might mean working part-time or consulting in the gap years between 55 and 62. Not for the income, but to keep adding to your 35-year earnings record. It might mean delaying Social Security to 67 or even 70, because if you can self-fund until 70, your benefit increases by 8% per year for every year you wait past your full retirement age. That's a guaranteed, inflation-adjusted 8% return on your Social Security decision. It might mean restructuring your healthcare strategy around ACA subsidies before Medicare kicks in. There are legitimate structural moves here, but they all start from the same place. Knowing what the system actually does to your benefit, not what you assumed it would do. Let's bring the number back. The one from the beginning of this video. The average Social Security benefit for a 62-year-old claiming in 2024 is around $1,298 per month. The average benefit for someone claiming at 67 with the same earnings history is approximately $1,837 per month. That's a gap of $539 per month. Over 20 years of retirement, that difference is $129,360 in cumulative benefit. And that's for an average earner, before the additional impact of the zeros in the 35-year calculation from stopping work at 55, and before the compounding reduction that comes from those missing peak earning years. For a higher earner, someone making $90,000 to $120,000 in their final working years, the monthly gap between claiming at 62 versus 70 can be $1,500 or more per month. Over 25 years, that's $450,000 in cumulative income. Gone. Permanently. Not because you made a mistake, because you made a decision that felt right at the time, with numbers that seemed to work on a system that was quietly calculating something you weren't. And here's the irreversibility that makes this different from almost every other financial decision you'll make. You can change your asset allocation, you can adjust your spending, you can sell a house, move somewhere cheaper, renegotiate your costs. Almost everything in retirement is adjustable. Social Security is not. Once you claim, the rate is locked. Once you leave the workforce with fewer than 35 earnings years, those zeros are in your calculation permanently. You don't get to go back to 54 and rethink it. The decision you make in the year or two before you retire, the one most people make in a state of relief and achievement, is one of the few retirement decisions that cannot be undone. There's also a sequence of returns risk that hits early retirees with particular force. If the market drops 25% in the first 3 years after you retire at 55, you're selling assets at depressed prices to fund your life while waiting to be eligible for any government income. You can't wait it out the way someone still employed can. You're drawing down a portfolio that's already underwater, and the math of recovery from that position is much harder than most people model. Morningstar's retirement research team has published repeatedly on this. The first decade of retirement is when your portfolio is most vulnerable to permanent impairment. And early retirees with long gap years before Social Security kicks in face the highest exposure to a bad sequence of returns at the worst possible time. The people who run out of money in their late 70s don't look back and say they got unlucky. They look back at a specific decision, often the one that felt like the finish line, and realize the math was running a different calculation than they thought. They outlived their model. And the reason they outlived it almost always has something to do with a number they never calculated precisely. Not because they weren't smart enough, but because the system doesn't advertise what it takes from you when you leave early. It just takes it. That's the number. And now you've seen it. You are not behind for thinking about this. You are not reckless for wanting to retire at 55. Wanting out early is not a character flaw. It's a rational response to spending decades trading time for money and finally reaching a point where the trade feels optional. That impulse is legitimate. What this video is about is the gap between the version of this decision that feels complete and the version that actually is complete. The system has rules that apply to early retirees differently than to everyone else. Those rules don't care about your intentions or your effort or how well you planned everything else. They just run the math. And once you know what the math actually produces under your specific timeline, not a projection, not a best-case estimate, but the real number with the zeros and the claiming penalties and the healthcare costs accounted for, the decision becomes something you own rather than something that happens to you. That's not a guarantee that early retirement is the wrong call. For some people with the right structure, 55 is exactly right. But it's a decision that deserves the precise version of the calculation, not the comfortable one.